Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for joining the Rank Prize Funds this evening for this, the 29th presentation of prizes. It's wonderful to see everyone here for our summer prize giving, not fighting snow and ice in the winter as we used to. I would like to welcome our prize winners who have made some epic journeys to be here, and also to welcome Professor Dame Sally Davies, who is our guest of honour to present the prizes this evening. Whilst it's a joy to see so many familiar faces at these awards, it is also sad that John Mathers, the chair of the Nutrition Committee, and Cyrus Cooper, trustee of the Rank Prizes, are unable to attend, and we wish them well in their convalescence. As ever, the selection of the prize winners has been a demanding challenge, and I'm indebted to Donald Bradley and John Mathers for their deft chairing of the scientific committees and the members of these committees, not only for their inspired selection tonight, but also for their diligent and well-judged application of these funds. I believe our work remains current, hugely relevant, and supportive of scientific research community, both in supporting and in our research, encouraging our next generation of researchers, but also in recognising the impact and the application of this research. With the change from our usual January scheduling, not all of our committee members could be here tonight, but I would like to record our thanks for their outstanding work and support. As with previous years, they have selected our grants carefully from a wide spectrum of pure research. This year, we've also selected our first Lord Selborne PhD scholarship, in memory of John Selborne, our late chairman. It's an Optoelectronics award to support research into the arrangement of photoreceptor cells in the trichochromatic retina. We've also held our first joint symposium between the Nutrition and Optoelectronic committees, looking at using the electromagnetic spectrum to improve crop production. Whilst it's not vital to find common ground between our two disciplines, it is interesting to understand the where and the what this collaboration can achieve. I'm also very happy to welcome some of our early career researchers who have been recognised for their best presentation at symposia. Supporting early career researchers is a cornerstone of the Rank Prizes, and it's good to see them and hopefully inspire them to be future prize winners. I would also like to pay tribute to our small executive team who have worked so hard to keep the programme running over the year. They've organised an excellent prize giving tonight and maintain a full and well-managed schedule of symposia and wider grants. Since we last celebrated the prize giving in 2022, this has included 14 symposia, 28 undergraduate grants, 4 travelling bursaries, 11 rank lectures, 4 fora, and 5 new lecturer awards. So Sam, Philippa, Lindsay, and our finance team, Heather and Marco, thank you for all you've done and achieved. I'm immensely grateful to Professor Dame Sally Davies for carving out time in a hugely busy diary and joining us to present our prizes tonight. Pure science and its research and its application have always been vital for any nation, but being able to then engage and weave this international policy and ensure that politicians understand the importance and implications of that science is both a huge skill and a significant altruistic personal commitment. After a distinguished career in medicine, focusing on haematology with special research into sickle cell disease, Dame Sally joined the civil service in 2004. She was then the Chief Medical Officer from 2010 to 2019. During that time, she also served on the Executive Board of the World Health Organization from 2014 to 2016. It is particularly important for us to understand that interface between policy, research, and for us, nutrition. And her guidance around food and obesity will resonate with our nutrition prize tonight. In 2019, she became the first woman to be appointed Master of Trinity College, Cambridge. She is also currently the UK Special Envoy to the United Nations on antimicrobial resistance. Interestingly, one of our nutrition symposia since our last gathering was alternatives to antimicrobials and their implication for the food chain. So something there to have a discussion later. She was elected Fellow of the Royal Society in 2014 and a member of the National Academy of Medicine in the United States of America in 2015. So Dame Sally, welcome and thank you very much for coming. We'll now move on to the prize giving. And first is nutrition, and I'll ask Professor John Wilding to give the citation for the prize awarded for their work on the use of low-energy diets to understand pathogenesis of type 2 diabetes and the subsequent trials that have led to the possibility of disease remission. John, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and good evening, everybody. It really does give me great pleasure to have the opportunity to read this citation for Roy Taylor and Mike Lean, both of whom I've known as friends and colleagues for many years now. So their work on type 2 diabetes, we have to remember type 2 diabetes is a disabling, life-shortening disease which is mediated by excess or abnormal body fat accumulation. Work by Professor Mike Lean in the 1990s, when he actually held the Rank Prize Chair of Human Nutrition in Glasgow, showed that a high waist circumference, as a measure of central adiposity, even in people with an apparently healthy body mass index, was associated with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. In other research, he showed that weight loss really early after the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, within the first year, was associated with improved prognosis. And people who lost 15 kilograms or more of their body weight had improved life expectancy, which actually matched people without diabetes. Professor Roy Taylor's research really triangulated on some of this work, early work by Mike, and what he did was worked on liver and muscle, and in 2008 this led to the twin cycle hypothesis that you'll hear much more about in much more detail from Roy shortly. But what this, in a nutshell, shows was that looking at liver and muscle, type 2 diabetes is caused by excess fat, leading to insulin resistance in liver and muscle and decline in beta cell function, which produces the hormone insulin, in the pancreas. He then went on to test this hypothesis in a study in 2011 called the Counterpoint study that looked at people with a recent onset of type 2 diabetes and treated them with a liquid meal replacement diet, just 800 calories a day, while studying their metabolism and the deposition of fat in various organs. And what that study showed was that people lost weight, about 15 kilograms, again, of weight, and looking at the fat in different organs shows that the fat was reduced, the insulin resistance improved, and beta cell function improved. And this showed that the changes of type 2 diabetes could actually be reversed with weight loss, at least early in the course of the disease. The follow-up counterbalance study included people with more long-standing diabetes, and although still effective at improving insulin resistance and improving beta cell function, the intervention was less effective at producing remission once diabetes had been established for more than 6 years, showing that early intervention is best. Further collaboration with Mike Lean led to the design and conduct of the Diabetes Remissions Clinical Trial, or the DIRECT trial. And this was funded by Diabetes UK and translates these earlier research findings into a practical and importantly scalable intervention using liquid meal replacements for a duration of about 8 to 12 weeks, followed by gradual introduction of normal food. This could be delivered in primary care. This led to maintained weight loss of over 10 kilograms on average and remission of diabetes in almost half of the participants after 1 year. Over 3/4 of those were still in remission after 2 years, and subsequent research has shown that this intervention is also successful in people with relatively low body weight, not only those living with visible obesity, and leading to the concept of a personal fat threshold for risk of diabetes. The principles established in the direct intervention is now being rolled out across NHS Scotland and NHS England as the Type 2 Diabetes Path to Remission programme. And over 5,000 people with diabetes have now had the opportunity to be offered the intervention, with early results being consistent with what was seen in the direct trial. This work has been recognised internationally, and the results have been reproduced in many other countries, including the Middle East, Australia, New Zealand, Malaysia, Nepal, and Barbados. The approach is now included as a treatment option in the joint American Diabetes Association and European Association for the Study of Diabetes Standards of Care document. And famously, it has been popularised in an accessible form by the late Michael Mosley. This research is making a real difference to the lives of many people with type 2 diabetes, and the researchers are really worthy recipients of the Rank Prize for Nutrition. Thank you.
Dame Sally, if I could ask you to come up and present the prizes. Come that side, yeah. Firstly, Professor Mike Liang. Thank you very much. Second one. And Professor Roy Taylor, please. Can you ask the camera up the top? And now I'd ask Professor Roy Taylor if you could do the response to John Welding's introduction with a citation.
Dame Sally, Stuart, John, thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, Mike and I are delighted to receive this award, of course acknowledging the input of all our fantastic research collaborators. But what causes type 2 diabetes? Well, that question led me on to use muscle biopsy and also fat biopsy over many years, not techniques enormously popular with research participants. So when I realized the advances in magnetic resonance spectroscopy and the possibility of tracking metabolism in vivo, in real time, I set about fundraising for the Newcastle Magnetic Resonance Centre. 4 years of that, much help, I'd say, by Anya Hulbert. Thank you, Anya. And we opened after 2 years of building, and we were able to chase food in the body and get to some understanding of real life and metabolism, a gap in previous physiology. So where did you put your breakfast? Well, we can tell you, because if you have relatively normal response in your muscles to the hormone insulin, then 5 hours after a meal, a third of it will be in muscle, dependent on insulin sensitivity. Some in liver, most of it oxidized, and a tiny bit gets converted to fat and stored. That is the only other pathway to handle incoming glucose. But if you happen to have insulin resistance in muscle, that is really very common, huge numbers in the population, and that's the earliest warning sign that type 2 diabetes might come on, then instead of this pattern, it is this pattern. Look at the glycogen in muscle, trivial, 8% in this particular study. This similar, that not dissimilar, but look at this, converted to fat and stored. But not just any old fat, because this process produces 100% saturated fat. Now, the product, which is a carbon-16 saturated fatty acid chain, palmitic acid, is the most inhibitory for the beta cell. Hang on, can we tie this together? The insulin resistance in muscle, which is largely genetic, and this beta cell problem that's always been seen as separate. So that led to the postulation of the hypothesis, the twin-cycle hypothesis. Now, we had done work in parallel looking at liver fat in type 2 diabetes, and we'd shown that it absolutely determined the level of response of the liver to insulin. And if there's excess liver fat, then the liver doesn't respond very well, and plasma glucose levels tend to rise because the liver throws out too much glucose. That becomes a vicious cycle, the liver cycle of the twin. But too much fat in the liver means that too much fat will be put out for the rest of the body. That's one of the major functions of the liver, just sitting there silently, minding its own business. But too much fat export means that too much will form in all sorts of wrong places, including inside the pancreas. And inside the pancreas, from that very early work I mentioned, I wonder if beta cell dysfunction might occur. Now, this was a hypothesis. Important to define a hypothesis, because you need to define an experiment, a study, to try and kill off your hypothesis. How can we kill this off? Well, cut off its head. If we were to remove the supply for this excess fat, in other words, achieve a big drop in food intake, negative calorie balance, we would expect to clear out the liver of the fat. It's readily available for energy, so that would clear, and theoretically, everything would normalize. So we could disprove our hypothesis with a very simple study, take a group of people with ordinary type 2 diabetes. We had to devise a way of getting them to lose what I calculated would have to be 15 kilograms to remove fat from the pancreas. And so we devised a low-calorie liquid diet which satisfied the vital point that I'd learnt from all my patients, sitting listening to them in the clinic over 40 years. What's the difficulty of losing weight? Well, it becomes the day-to-day cumulative burden of deciding what to eat, how much to eat. It really gets to people. Also, hunger is a problem, and on less than 1,000 calories a day, that begins to disappear. So, what happened when we tested this? Well, let me show you first the results of what we saw in the liver. This is an MRI scan across the upper abdomen. Now, every pixel is color-coded for the amount of fat at that point in space. Red, 100%, so fat just under the skin, the fatty layer all around us and over the back here, fat. But look at this organ here. This is the liver, and what an unpleasant color. Specifically, it was 36% fat. Human foie gras walking around in a person who knew nothing about any liver problem because they just had simple type 2 diabetes. This person was restudied at the end of the counterpoint study, and this is a liver, 2% liver fat. So this was a very dramatic result, but of course I've shown you an extreme example. So let me show you the actual data. 800 calories for 8 weeks, stop the drugs on day 1, shock horror. And here we see the high baseline level falling to, now less than 5% is regarded as normal. Our rather chubby matched control group was higher than that, but look, dropping to 2%. Amazing. So did that affect blood glucose control? This is a measure of average blood glucose control. You bet it did. It fell so fast that this 2-month average of control had entered the normal range. How about the fat being put out by the liver? Normal. Something that had never really been achieved in diabetes before with any drug. Pancreas fat dropped and the insulin response returned. Absolutely dramatic and jaw-dropping data for experts who believed that the beta cells could never be woken up, never be restored. So we obviously wanted to move forward from this, and questions arose, naturally. The experts said, well, this is just a starvation effect. The diabetes will come back as soon as normal eating is restored. Well, we can test that. So we carried out the counterbalance study, and this showed that remission lasted for at least 6 months after the end of the low-calorie diet period. We also showed that the duration of diabetes mattered, and that led to the 6-year guidance that's been applied ever since. But don't worry if you've had it for 21 years. There's a small percentage chance it will still go back to normal. But also, beta cell experts didn't like this. They said, oh, well, that's just because you've lost a lot of weight. The fat will go down everywhere. It's nothing to do with the beta cells. So we got people without diabetes to lose a similar amount of weight and showed that there was no decrease in pancreas fat in 8 weeks. This is a diabetes-specific thing which only drops. Now, in direct, which Mike will discuss, we repeated all these studies and extended them, following it up to the 2-year mark. But at this point, the big question arose. We knew this about diabetes, but could it be applied to clinical practice? Clinical practice in primary care where diabetes is managed. Well, the direct study was born. Diabetes UK, which had funded my first study, the Counterpoint study, and on to the direct study eventually, kindly supported us and in fact brought Mike and I together because they suggested we work together to do the really big job of testing this approach in primary care. At this point, I'll hand on to Mike to continue the story. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Roy. And thanks very much to the rank. I have a lot to thank the rank for. They funded my entire department for 10 years and put nutrition back on the map in medical practice, in medical care, and in human research. It's not a widely known fact that the small boy here pushing the bicycle up the hill to deliver the bread is none other than Professor Roy Taylor, supplementing his meagre grant as a medical But it's also not widely known that Roy and I started our medical careers on the same day in the same hospital in Edinburgh, and we've become friends and remained friends ever since. So when Dame Barbara Young of Old, Scone, brought us together through Diabetes UK to do this study, this was sort of a very special occasion. At any rate, my part in the story, my route into the story, was another thank you to the MRC and the Dunn Nutrition Laboratory in Cambridge, who appointed me to do research into this obesity metabolic field, which was very new and very dodgy. It was not by any means guaranteed to take us anywhere concrete. The excitement was obese mice, OBOB mice, genetically obese mice, absent function of brown adipose tissue, and they also had type 2 diabetes. And my job was to look to see, does this work in humans? And so a lot of time was spent isolating and uncoupling protein from the mitochondria of brown adipose tissue in humans, showing it all functions very well. But it didn't function in humans with type 2 diabetes. Put them in a cold place, they just get colder, just like the obese mice. Different mechanisms completely, but the idea was formulating that there was something special going on in organs which were full of fat and not functioning. And this led on to a great series of publications which showed that people with a big waist circumference, as John Wilding pointed out, have intra-organ ectopic fat within the abdomen initially, but in other places as well, and that this is associated with a risk of type 2 diabetes and of premature heart disease. And that took us into further work, which was lit up by other people. This famous study here, which shows John Yudkin and Chittaranjan Yasnik, two professors we know well who've been to rank symposia, and it was to demonstrate that they had such totally different body fat compositions, although their body mass indices were the same. And that study was used to point out differences between races. For me, this was a study which said we now have a handle on why some people have a very high risk, genetic risk of type 2 diabetes if they come from Asian countries. And that took us deeply into our thoughts. And logic then applied to say if this disease is caused by fat accumulation, this is where Roy and I come together, losing weight should get rid of it. So the study, which again John mentioned, was done actually in Aberdeen, where we took people to see when they lost weight under the instruction of the terror that the dietitians gave them to make them lose weight against their will in many cases in the first year of diagnosis. If they lost more weight, they lived longer. And as John pointed out, those who lived those who lost 15 kilograms, 14 kilograms, actually lived just as long as people who never had type 2 diabetes. And this point here, without weight loss, these people died 7 years younger. That figure is pretty much the same today as it was in 1990. And if you're under the age of 40, you'll die 15 years younger. This is a very serious disease, and perhaps we had neglected some of that. So, Again, we went out and said, can we do better than is being done at present? Let us design a diet program that can actually get a weight loss of 15, in this case 17 kilograms in a large number of people, and maintain it pretty well for a year. These are the days up to a year. The black is the period when they were actually taking a formula diet and they took no normal food for about 12 weeks to get the weight loss off quickly. And as you can see, those who lost weight more quickly, did really well, were the ones who did really well up to a year. It's also worth noting that although about half of our patients did everything they were asked to do, there were a fair number who didn't, and some are up at the top who simply didn't do anything at all. So there are other methods that are required to help people to lose that weight if they can't do it under their own steam. The results of DIRECT, I'm showing here, this was a study of people who were diagnosed within 6 years of the start, and we set out to try to get a remission of diabetes of 20% or more, actually 22%, because that was the figure we were told would have to result in a change in how diabetes is being managed nationally. So thank you to Diabetes UK. Of all the people who have donated money to diabetes, this is a charity, there was no government money, no commercial money in it. They put up this study. It was a large study. It brought together the mechanistic and the clinical aspects of this trial. And as John mentioned, at year one, average weight loss was 10 kilograms, so not everybody did brilliantly well, but a lot of them did a lot better than that. Almost half were free from diabetes without the need for medication for at least a year. And at 2 years, that figure had dropped to 36%, and you can say, well, that's a shame, isn't it? But it taught us something, because Roy was on hand to prove that that drop was caused by 15 individuals who had regained weight to a point closer than 10 kilograms from their starting point. And they regained that ectopic fat, that intra-organ ectopic fat in the liver and in the pancreas. And he was able to show that their insulin secretion had dropped but came back up again, had increased but came back down again by that second year. So this really told us something very fundamental about the disease. It is reversible, but it's a precarious situation. These people remained overweight, and it was liable to go back. The diabetes was liable to come back again to relapse if they regained weight. The weight losses were quite staggering. If they were able to lose 15 kilograms, 86%, nearly 9 out of 10, were free from diabetes without medication at 1 year, 82% at 2 years, very well maintained if they could keep that weight loss off. And that was the difficult part, and we haven't beaten every problem in that area. What it did say, only 14% failed to get remission, but of those 14%, most of them had enormous improvements, and probably they actually needed to lose a little more weight. They remained, these are pretty hefty people, body mass index 35 to start with. Notably, only about 3% got no improvement. So almost nobody was disadvantaged by this intervention. And actually, those who lost weight didn't get a improvement of diabetes, actually did benefit in other ways. So it's a kind of win-win-win intervention. One of the things we did, as well as stopping the diabetes medications on day one, was to stop their blood pressure medications. Because most people, the majority of people with type 2 diabetes also have high blood pressure. What happens to their blood pressure? The GPs were terrified of this. And we said, no, we're not stopping treatment. We're giving them a better treatment. And here's the proof of that. The white line is people who are not previously on medication. This is a fall in blood pressure of around about 12 millimeters of mercury, an enormous drop in blood pressure. If you didn't, the people on medication are here, 1 drug, 2, 3, or 4 drugs in the yellow, their blood pressures all fell. So at this point, at the end of the formula diet period, around 10 millimeters of mercury below baseline, and most of them remained off their medication. A few had to go back onto medication. This is a very potent treatment for high blood pressure, perhaps because they're not eating so much salt during that period. We were able to follow people up for 5 years, and this paper was published just a few months ago. And what this showed was that if we followed up the individuals who'd been through the intervention, they had half as many serious adverse events during 5 years. That basically means hospital admissions for one thing or another, a lot of them diabetes-related. These are the figures over the 5 years. It's a halving of the hospital admissions. And we also showed that those who had been through the intervention and managed to lose weight, who had a lower body mass index, who had a lower hemoglobin A1C, that's the sort of average blood sugar, and those who had longer periods in remission of their diabetes, were relatively free from diabetes-related clinical events, and that's mainly infections, but other things as well. And the really good news, people who start off seriously overweight with type 2 diabetes, who are given a program that works in primary care where they're normally managed, and this is being looked after by their nurse or their dietitian if there is one. Doctors had very little to do with this. Their quality of life improved substantially and actually quite dramatically. And that's a message, because if you lose, probably in this room, some of you have actually set about and lost 5 kilograms in weight because somebody said that was a good idea. That's hard work, 5 kilograms. You don't feel better, you don't even look better, and it doesn't improve quality of life. It's hard work. Lose 10 or 15 kilograms, quality of life really improves, especially if you get rid of your diabetes, and that's maintained for 5 years. So there you go. The knock-on of this, and that is where Michael Mosley was dear to all of us as a friend, a fun person. He publicised this, and we've done our own. Roy produced a Newcastle diet, which is up online. We produce a thing called the No Doubts diet in Scotland, which is a bit of a caricature. If you want to lose weight, you don't have to go on a special formula diet. There are many, many ways of doing it, and this was my meal for one day that I photographed a few weeks ago. There it is. And we have a project in Nepal which has proved successful using totally traditional foods. So I am now working in a number of countries to move our discoveries from the UK, with all the backing we've had here, to countries where type 2 diabetes is much more common than in the UK, where in a sense we, the West, have landed this disease on them through weight gain and the trappings of westernization, and we're looking to try and resolve that by celebrating traditional foods and putting that before them. And on that note, I should say thank you very much. We'll leave Roy Taylor to roll down the street in happiness, and if the next one comes on, I'm going to really offend you all by playing a little clip.
It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll.
Roy, Michael, thank you very, very much for that wonderful presentation, which even me as a Luddite can understand. It was fantastic. Now, Anya, if we could ask you to come up. Professor Anya Hulber will give the citation for the prize awarded for the development of instruments that use adaptive optic technologies to capture high-resolution images of the live human retina. Anya, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart. It is an enormous honor to read the citation for the 2024 Rank Prize for Optoelectronics, which is awarded to Dr. Junzhong Liang, Professor Donald T. Miller, Professor Austin Roorda, and Professor David R. Williams, for their development of instruments that use adaptive optics technologies to capture high-resolution images of the living human retina. Their pioneering research has generated new fundamental insights into the structure and function of the human eye in health and disease, as well as new clinical interventions to remedy sight loss from common disorders. Now, the retina at the back of the eye is part of the brain, and it's the only part of the brain visible to the outside. The retina is a complex three-dimensional structure with multiple richly interconnected layers of cells. And because of the complexity of the neural processing that takes place in the retina, it's often called a mini brain. And with the ordinary ophthalmoscope, it's possible, looking through the pupil, to see the surface of the retina and its major blood vessels and vital landmarks. And further, with the technique of optical coherence tomography, which was developed in the early 1990s, it's possible to see images of cross-sections of the layers of the retina. And OCT, by the way, has already rolled out to high street opticians. I imagine many of you in this room have had your eyes OCT imaged, and that is used to reveal the damage caused by, for example, glaucoma and macular degeneration. Yet, it was not until the invention of closed-loop adaptive optics-based imaging, the invention of this technique by Drs. Liang, Professor Williams, and Professor Miller in 1997, that individual photoreceptors, the cells that actually sense the incoming light, were first photographed in clear, exquisite detail in the living human eye. The previous attempts to image individual cells were hampered by the aberrations caused by the eye's lens and the other components in the eyes. These distorted the light waves entering the eye and exiting the eye through the pupil, which caused the resulting images to be irrevocably blurred. So adaptive optics is a technique used in astronomy to reduce the image blur in ground-based telescopes. Now, the prize winner's seminal invention in 1997 brought this astronomical technique used to visualize distant, vast planets into ophthalmology and vision science to visualize microscopic components inside the eye. And the prize winner's phenomenal achievement was to combine adaptive optics with an objective wavefront sensor to create a retinal imaging camera that precisely controlled the incoming and outgoing light and thereby compensated for the eye's natural aberrations. And in 1999, the instrument was used by Professor Austin Roorda and Professor David R. Williams to produce the first ever images that showed the layout of the 3 distinct cone types in the human retina that are used for color vision. And this revealed a surprising randomness and a heterogeneity between people in the spatial distribution of the long and middle wavelength sensitive cones. And this addressed a long-standing theoretical debate. And since the landmark feat in 1997, the field of adaptive optics-based retinal imaging has expanded rapidly, incorporating technological advances and other imaging modalities to yield unprecedented resolution and speed in visualizing discrete cells across all layers of the retina. So in one key advance, a scanning laser ophthalmoscope has been incorporated in place of the original fundus camera, which makes a fundamentally different imaging modality, and this AOSLO instrument has improved efficiency, signal-to-noise ratio, and image contrast. In another advance, adaptive optics has been combined with optical coherence tomography to create AOSD-OCT, which yields for the first time the imaging of living cells at high speed across all the layers. So from these further major developments, in which I should say all 4 prize winners have continued to play leading roles, new insights into the fundamental structure and function of the living human eye have emerged, as well as clinical applications and interventions for the better understanding and treatment of eye disease. So in summary, the adaptive optics retinal imaging techniques pioneered by the Rank Prize for Optoelectronics 2024 awardees, Dr. Liang, Professor Miller, Professor Roorda, and Professor Williams, have enabled microscopic, real-time visualization of the retina without invasive surgery, thereby driving advances in the understanding and betterment of human vision. And I hope we will see some of these fabulous images in the presentation by Professor Williams. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Dame Sally, if I could ask you to come up again and present the prizes. Firstly, Dr. Junzhong Liang. Look up Professor Donald T. Miller. Dr. Austin Roorda. And finally, Professor David T. Williams. Thank you. And now Professor David T. Williams is going to give the response to the citation. David, thank you very much.
Thank you. And Anya, you nailed it. I don't know, can I just hand over my slides to you and let you continue because you were awesome. What a great honor for all 4 of us to have this opportunity to speak with you tonight and to receive this wonderful coveted award. You know, it's especially important to me, this award, because it's an opportunity for me to expound on all the wonderful things my 3 former postdocs did in Rochester and beyond since then in their own independent careers. And it's really great to do this. And in part because I know there are some offspring in the audience. And you know, it's very hard to communicate sometimes with your offspring and explain what it is that you do and that it might actually be important. And to sort of capture that notion, I'll just refer to a comment my daughter made famously many years ago around the dining room table, in which she said, "Dad, I don't know what you're going to say, but it's going to be wrong." So I know I've lost that battle, but you know, maybe your children over here will appreciate that your fathers are really remarkable scientists and engineers, and don't you ever forget it. Okay, so thank you to the Rank Foundation. Thank you to those who traveled far and wide to get here. We all really appreciate that. So let me start the story by taking you back. Oh, I forgot to show you the families. But here they are. And and thank you, Kate, Inger, Xiaofeng, and Liang, for your support of us throughout this entire time period as well, when we were developing these technologies over more than a quarter of a century. Now, I want to start the story with this gentleman, Thomas Young, who, as you know, was a brilliant scientist with an indefatigable curiosity about the world generally, and vision in particular sometimes. And he published in 1802 this remarkable paper in which he posited that color vision depends on 3 signals arising out of the retina. And we subsequently learned that he was absolutely right. And here you can see a beautiful picture of the cone photoreceptors in a mammalian eye. Each of these cells has a different photopigment in it. There are 3 different kinds of photopigments that confer color vision. So we learned all that, but what we didn't know, and what's been an outstanding question for 200 years, is how these things are organized, how these 3 kinds of cones are patterned in the retina. So I want to introduce you to another brilliant Cambridge scholar, and that would be Donald McLeod from UC San Diego. And when he was a young assistant professor, I had the pleasure and honor of working with him on a problem related to this question of how the 3 kinds of cones are arranged. And so to keep this a little short in the interest of time, I'll just say that this map here with the blue spots shows you a map that we made in one particular subject that showed the distribution of the short wavelength sensitive cones, one of the 3 classes of cones. And indeed they were, as Don had predicted, sparse in the retina, and surprisingly sparse in the retina, accounting for only 6% or so of the cells we ultimately determined much later. This also showed that you can elicit a visual sensation in a human being by having all the light fall on a single cell. About 10 photon absorptions in a single cell generates a visual experience, which was amazing to us. And I sort of got hooked, thanks to Don. And Don is here in the audience, right there. And so thank you so much on behalf of all of us, because this not only completely changed my career, but all of my students, those here and others, have also gone off on completely different paths than they otherwise would have without your insight and brilliance. So thanks so much for that. All right, so this is what a picture I gave to Don when I finished my PhD. And it was sort of a corny way of showing how much I thought I had grown in the course of my PhD. So it was a little optical trick. It's all done with mirrors, right? But I did not know at the time, this was 15 years before I realized just how important deformable mirrors would actually be to vision science. And so that is the next part of my story here. So much later, Don Miller and I decided, well, maybe we can actually take real pictures rather than doing these subjective psychophysical experiments. Maybe we can take pictures of these cones that are so hard to study because they're stuck back there in the intact eye, and they're they're encapsulated inside the eye, difficult to get to. When you try to remove them, they tend to dissolve and fall apart and things like that. So there are tricks to try to do that well, but they're hard to do. And so Don developed an ophthalmoscope that was specially designed to magnify the retina in such a way that he could see for the very first time cones in the living human eye. And that was a huge achievement, Don, so thanks for doing that as a graduate student in the lab. But we knew that this wasn't really enough. We needed to make it better. And so we need to understand how adaptive optics comes into the story. You need to understand the wave aberration. So if you put a pencil of light, very narrow beam of light, into the eye and let it bounce off the back of the eye, what comes out is a sort of warped pancake. And it's warped because the cornea and lens are imparting these aberrations that Anya was telling you about. And what you'd like to be able to do, this surface that you're seeing there, which is called the wave aberration, completely describes all the important aberrations in your eye, much better than a prescription for glasses, which of course also improves your vision. So this is a really important function to be able to measure, and then you'd like to be able to correct it as well. And so adaptive optics is a technology for measuring and correcting this thing called the wave aberration. So we could remove the blur that occurs in retinal imaging and improve the quality of the images better than the ones that Don got in his first pass so many years ago. So this is how that works. On the left, you need a measurement device, and that's a Shack-Hartman or Hartman-Shack wavefront sensor. You take that wavefront that's warped and you dice it up with those lenslets and cast it on a sensor in the back there, and you can then compute with an algorithm, you can compute what the wave aberration is, and then if you warp this deformable mirror and then cast the distorted wavefront on the mirror, if it's warped just in the right way, it comes off flat, and that's just what you want in order to remove the blur from images in this camera that we have of taking pictures of the retina. Now, as Anya said, adaptive optics originated in astronomy, and here's the Keck telescope on the summit of Mauna Kea, Hawaii, that is equipped with adaptive optics and is doing wonderful things, looking, for example, at the black hole at the center of our galaxy and many, many other things. And the first people to ever apply or attempt to apply adaptive optics to retinal imaging was a group led by Joseph Biela at the University of Heidelberg. And they worked very hard to try to get adaptive optics to work. They never quite managed to pull it off, but they did something very important. They got halfway, and they got halfway because of the work of this gentleman right over here, Junzhong Liang, who was able to do the first part, the wavefront aberration measurement part with a wavefront sensor. And so that was his PhD thesis. Here you can see him standing next to Joseph Biela, and even if you didn't know Joseph Biela, you know he's looking very proud at this moment, and justifiably so, because this was a transformative achievement. Forget about retinal imaging. Just think about what this has done to the fields of optometry and ophthalmology, where now we have this complete description of the aberrations in the eye generated by a wavefront sensor, and it's changed the way people design spectacles, contact lenses, intraocular lenses, and laser refractive surgery. All of those things have benefited from Junzhong's invention, and millions of people now worldwide have better vision today thanks to what you did. So thank you so much. And you might think, you know, that contribution would be adequate for one career, but no, we're just getting started. Because Liang then joined us at the University of Rochester, and all that expertise that he had acquired and developed on his own at Heidelberg, he brought to Rochester, joined Don Miller, who had built this wonderful camera, and the two of them together built the first deformable mirror system, adaptive optics ophthalmoscope for the eye. And you can see the improvement in images of cones here on the right with adaptive optics off and adaptive optics on. So that was a real breakthrough for our lab, and thank you both for making that possible. All right, and then Austin Roorda, when he was an assistant professor at the University of Houston, embellished this technology by combining confocal imaging with adaptive optics ophthalmoscopy. And here you can see what you get there. You get this movie, that's really nice. And you can also optically section the retina so you can see that it's different layers. And it is a multi-layered structure with a lot of computational horsepower, as Anya was saying. So this was a major improvement. And also, you can see the eye movements that are happening here, right? Because the eye is always moving. No matter how hard you try to keep it still, it's always jerking around like this, and that's a problem for imaging, but Austin turned that into an asset because he figured out how to use those motions, measuring them, and use them to develop the most accurate eye tracker that's ever been developed for the human eye. So he can track the retina, and I didn't confirm this number with him, but in our hands using this, I think we get about 200 or 300 nanometers of error in tracking the retina, which is way smaller than the size of the smallest cells in the retina. So here's an example of an image obtained with this combined technology. And here you can see not only the cones, which are the big fat cells there, but also the smaller rods, which are the smallest photoreceptor class in the human retina, the cones being responsible for daytime vision, the rods for nighttime vision. And then, that wasn't enough. Going back to his postdoc at Rochester, in that time, he solved this question that had been dangling out there since Thomas Young first proposed the trichromatic theory of color vision. He combined adaptive optics with a technique called retinal densitometry and was able to classify individual cones in a living human eye. And here's an example of one of the images that he was able to generate with that technique. So that was an incredible coup and really game changer for us. And then Joe Carroll started using this technique to look at abnormal eyes. And Don Miller followed in Joe's footsteps, but created a brand new way of classifying cones based on OCT, which Anya talked about. And now he can do this 60 times faster than Austin and I can do it with our former technique, and 250 times more accurately. And you know, I can't tell you how exhilarating it is when one of your students surpasses you, except when they do it by orders of magnitude. Coming back to Austin, now Austin picked up the ball and he developed a way using this eye tracking capability to track individual cones. Don and I didn't have that capability. We had poor optics, relatively speaking, which adaptive optics corrects. We had just the existing eye movements of the eye completely uncorrected. Now Austin can go in and measure the perceptual experience produced by whatever cell he likes. And he's taken it even one step further by illuminating just, for example, one cone class, like the L or the M sensitive cones, in this case, the green sensitive cones, some would say. And so you can just see one kind of cone illuminated there, and that's something that never happens in the real world. Never happens. And so what happens? What's the world going to look like if you're looking at it with only one cone class instead of all three? And what this graph shows you, this is the domain here of normal color experience that you can get in the real world. And Austin is producing color experiences that are hypersaturated, that have essentially never been experienced before. And that's truly a remarkable scientific discovery that only Austin could have done, and with adaptive optics. Okay, well, you might think, well, that's all you can do is look at photoreceptors. What's the big deal? But in fact, the retina is multi-layered, and there are also these wonderful cells there that represent the output of the retina. They're called retinal ganglion cells, and each of you has 1.2 million of them, in roughly speaking, in each of your eyes. And here on the right, you can see an adaptive optics image of those cells, and you can see that they come in many flavors. And we don't really, even some of you vision scientists probably think we know a lot about what these cells do. We really don't. And we think that there's a lot more work that needs to be done to really appreciate what the code is that the retina is using to transmit the retinal image to the brain. We do think that each of these cell classes is conveying its own independent image in a way up to the brain. And so there are many, many dozens perhaps of different images being processed by the brain simultaneously, speaking to the computational horsepower that exists in this very thin, fragile structure. Okay, so we have a way of labeling these cells with a fluorescent dye that changes its intensity depending on the activity of the cell, depending on the signal that each cell is sending to the brain. And Sarah Patterson is using this to deliver visual stimuli over on the left to the cones, and then watching what the ganglion cells do on the right. And she can classify ganglion cells that way. And she's found 15 different classes of ganglion cells in the fovea, a place that's been very difficult to record from in the past. Now with this in vivo method where the retina is essentially pristine and not removed from the eye and put in a dish, as is the usual case, we can do this in a living eye and study these cells in a way that hasn't been possible before. Now Don, coming back to Don Miller, has also picked up on this because he has developed this AO-OCT method to look at ganglion cells among everything. He can look at any cell he wants to in the retina now because he has this exquisite ability to look at separate layers independently. So what you're looking at here are actually those ganglion cells I was talking about before, but this time he can do this without any dyes. No need to do any dyeing. You just look at the native cells because of the optical properties that they have. And so he can see the ganglion cell mosaic, and he can even see the loss of cells over time. Now, so while you're sitting here, well, over the past 24 hours, each of us has probably lost on average about 3 ganglion cells. I'm sorry to say, to announce. Don't be depressed. It happens to all of us, and we all do fine. But you can see one cell dropping out just by analyzing a single patient here, on day 1 and then a year later. You can watch the loss of a single cell in the retina. Now, there are diseases, and there are many of these, that destroy ganglion cells. And wouldn't it be nice to be able to track that problem quickly rather than slowly? And these diseases like glaucoma are very slowly progressing in some cases. And Don estimates that he can see progression in glaucoma in a 20th the time that conventional techniques that just look at the layer, the thickness of the layer can do. So a remarkable achievement technically that I think in the future will offer great promise for evaluating therapies on a rapid time scale, because you have this very rapid ability to assess what's happening with ganglion cells. I'm looking down to make sure I'm telling the truth. So finally, one last example of the clinical application of adaptive optics. This is an image from Richard Rosen, who, for our purposes today, is our poster child ophthalmologist who's embraced this technology and is using it in his clinical practice. And here, so this is a patient, and he's able to image using phase contrast adaptive optics technology. He's able to see individual blood cells flowing through the veins and arteries in this patient's eye. And this patient suffers from sickle cell anemia, which is a debilitating disease, not just for the visual system, but for the whole person. And wouldn't it be nice to be able to develop therapies for this more rapidly? And he's shown that this particular compound in the top is effective at changing the shape of these sickle cells and making them more normal looking. And he can see changes in the microstructure of the retina using this technology. So very exciting additional evidence for the clinical applicability. And, industry is involved too. Industry is making these devices here for 5 different companies, I guess, that are making one version of the adaptive optics ophthalmoscope. And then there are also a couple of companies, and Susanna Marcos is here, who's responsible for one of these visual simulators, because not only can you use this technology to get higher resolution images of the retina, you can also improve vision with them, and you could simulate what an intraocular lens would be like, or some other, maybe laser refractive surgery, so that a patient can see and choose the treatment that they prefer given their own visual situation. So there are a number of different commercial efforts in this regard, and I think that's growing, and I think it will continue to grow. Certainly we see in the number of papers published every year an increase in the clinical use of this technology. So that makes us all very happy, because when we started this, we were interested in this very specific question from basic science about how does color vision work and how is it implemented in the retina. And we had no idea at that time that the technology development that interest and that scientific curiosity drove would lead to something that was clinically useful and increasingly a widespread tool for improving vision. And Junzhong Liang is continuing to do that in his own work outside of adaptive optics. And if you want to learn more about what he's doing, check out and other things that other investigators around the world are doing with adaptive optics. Do check out the rolling presentation we have outside during the break. We don't want to interfere too much with your socialization, but you might catch a few interesting images up there. So thank you very much.
Anya, thank you very much for that brilliant citation, which brought it all to light. And David and the team, what a wonderful, wonderful story, and very, very, very understandable for all of us here in the audience. Thank you very, very much for that presentation as well. Dame Sally, thank you so much for presenting the prizes. You've also very, very kindly agreed to give some observations on the prizes and their interface with your experience in medicine, research and policy. So thank you very much for coming and talk to us as well.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Thank you very much to to everyone for inviting me to be here. I feel honoured to give these prizes to both groups. What wonderful work. And you won't know, but I used to run the biggest clinic for sickle cell disease in the country. So for me, that was particularly important. And as I read about this before I came, I was thinking, how do these two groups from such different areas come together? Nutrition, optoelectronics, both superbly deserving, as we've seen this evening, of their prizes. These prizes, as far as I can see, go back to 1972, awarded biennially. So 2 years ago was the 50th anniversary. And my golly, aren't they good? So if you look at what Professors Taylor and Liang have shown, how they can, in diabetes, they can really put, type 2, put patients into remission. That's amazing news for everyone. While Doctors Liang, Professors Miller, Roorda and Williams have developed their instruments giving high-resolution images, as we've seen so very beautifully, of the retina. New insights, new interventions. But their work does come together because as we think about the side effects of diabetes, more type 1, but also of diabetes and obesity, they do impact the retina, and as well as increasing cardiovascular events, cancer, renal failure, and things. So I'm rather interested in this side of it because, as you were told, I was the Chief Medical Officer in England for nearly a decade until September 2019, the role that the wonderful Chris Whitty now plays. And in that role, I advised government on public health, worrying that somewhere between 6 and 10% of our UK population have diabetes. That's more than 1 in 16 of the population. And as we heard, some have an increased predisposition, but most of the risk factors are lifestyle, diet, physical activity, alcohol, taking you to active travel and everything. So I was thinking about the fact that we have an election, and you may not know coming from abroad, but we have an election on Thursday, and on Friday morning we'll wake up to a new government, whether it is a refreshment of the present or, more likely, a fresh government. So I thought what I'd share with you in this public health area is some of what I'd like to say to this new government, actually regardless of politics. And I've been working with one of our think tanks, IPPR, on a commission on health and prosperity. Did you know that we have 900,000 missing workers in this country due to sickness, with the OBR estimating each missing worker reduces the tax take by £5,000. So, you know, if you think about the prosperity to individuals, their communities, and then to our society, better health, I want to argue to our new government, should be at the heart of any government's plan to drive up growth, which is what they're all talking about, growth, growth, growth. But good health is underpinned, as we all know, by healthy lifestyles, not being too fat, among other things. Importantly, poor health outcomes, including obesity, type 2 diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular disease, stroke, dementia, and others, are, as I said, all down to the same factors. Ones I haven't mentioned so far: likely vaping as well as smoking, excess alcohol, pollution, particularly air. The relationship, I think, is also demonstrated, so I'm looking forward to learning more over dinner, by the recent trial data from Ozempic, demonstrating reductions not just in weight and in type 2 diabetes, but significantly in cardiovascular events. But for governments, the important thing will be about how to prioritise the money they can spend, but much of this is actually about behaviours of us as communities and through the private sector activity. So much of this can be done at no financial cost. And if our new government really has sufficient political will, they can do a lot. Just remember the attitudes and the arguments before in this country we introduced seat belts. The arguments before we introduced the ban on smoking in public places or driving and alcohol blood levels. Polling shows that the majority of people in this country think governments should take bolder action on childhood obesity, among other things. And we all know that getting it right as individuals can be really hard, and I think that was discussed already. And it's partly about cost, fruit and veg, or difficulty in putting it, as you so beautifully put, it into normal everyday life. Exercise, shopping, cooking. The libertarians would tell us it's in the control of each of us as individuals. But actually, many of the products are addictive, smoking, alcohol, likely sugar, and we haven't talked about gambling, and I'm not going to. So people actually need help at multiple levels, including incentivizing healthy behaviours. And we need to leave aside that libertarian view that it's about the individual, because we all know, when we think about it, that the reality is we live in a flood of unhealthy food and life choices with a massive imbalance of spending and advertising between those promoting unhealthy foods, alcohol, confectionery, and those, including government, Diabetes UK, who do a wonderful job, attempting to inform, educate, and support people in their healthy choices. And I can remember from my own clinic how difficult it was to persuade patients to change their mind. I also know about the data, the information and data about how we react involuntarily. I do as the canapes go past, and then I think, oh no, this was supposed to be the day I didn't eat too much. It is very difficult. So we're going to have a whole of society, and that means a whole of government response. And that's got to be political will. As I said, it's not just about the money. It is difficult to make change, but we can. And the argument I'd like to put to our new government is the Climate Change Act in 2008 provided a really good blueprint for a common mission, a delivery architecture, and actually some properly supported processes. So we could think about treating health like climate and setting a legislated health equivalent of net zero target across all of government. I'm not going to go into the whole details, but just imagine if we all make sure the government realises they can change people's destinies without spending a lot of money, and actually give it between 2 and 5 years, the people will thank them. There aren't many things where the people thank governments, even if it's a bit later. And if you look across the world, countries like Korea and Singapore and Ireland less so, have shown some of what's possible. And it does mean focusing on healthy life expectancy and inequalities in that, not just standard life expectancy. I want them to have a health mission board that's truly cross-government. I want health in all policies. And I actually think we also need, taking from the climate example, a UK health investment bank to invest in innovation with the best health return on investment with the private sector we can do. It's appalling. Do you know that if a fast food company wants to set up next to a school, the planners can say no, it goes to court and public health loses because the directors of public health and the local authorities don't have the money to stop it. That's a matter of political will. They can change that. We need to change it. We need to bring the NHS much more into prevention. I would argue the evidence is there for alcohol minimum unit pricing. The evidence is there for various advertising bans on healthy food, the buy one, get one free. I'd like them to stop sports sponsorship from fast food countries. Review food labelling. Extend that soft drinks levy and promote exercise and active travel. So there are many things that they can do, and I've thought about this and even written a paper for them. But what I wanted to put to you was what we've seen is how deep science can help move things forward, and clinical science based on metabolic studies can move things forward. But how much better if only we could prevent a lot of this. And I'm hopeful that a new government might take this forward. So thank you again to Rank, Prize, and all of you, and what a pleasure to be here on such a joyful evening. Thank you.